All right, so welcome back to Sociological Theory. This week, we're going to be discussing Du Bois and pretty much all things W.E.B. Du Bois. And the reason why, several different reasons, but one is because of the reason why the book, The Scholar Denied, was written. The Scholar Denied was a piece written by Alden Morris. He's a professor at Northwestern University. And I would arguably say that this is one of the most important sociological texts, maybe written in the past 5 to 7 years. It has absolutely kind of helped to shape and change our foundation, the foundation of this discipline. Okay, so, and the reason why was because for so long Du Bois was not considered the father of sociology or one of the fathers of sociology. We've talked about Marx and Weber, Durkheim, Parsons may get thrown in there, maybe, and others. We talked about the big three, but the Du Bois oftentimes gets left out, and many people believe it was because of racism, right? It was because he was Black, and although sociology looks to dismantle systems of race, sometimes it can perpetuate it. And so the book, The Scholar Denied, basically says that, gives an argument that cannot be denied. There can't be a lot of pushback. You kind of have to accept, based on his research, that Du Bois is truly the father of sociology. And so that's why we're going to spend this week discussing and talking about Du Bois, because it is Du Bois that takes us into 20th century discussions particularly around race, but also into gender, also into capitalism, into economics, into the Black middle class. Du Bois literally embodies all of this just in his research alone. And so pretty much if you're going to go back to the foundational elements of most parts of sociology, you're more than likely going to run into Du Bois. And that's something that you can't say for Marx. That's something you can't say for Weber. That's something you can't say for Durkheim. But you can absolutely say that for Du Bois. So it's very important that we do this, that we talk about him. So Du Bois is absolutely the scholar denied. And so we spend that time talking about him, as well as being the race scholar who, again, ushers us into the 20th century and forces us as a country and as a world to think about race from a social constructionist lens, which then leads us into thinking about other identities from a social constructionist perspective as well. And so we're going to talk about that later. So this week is all about Du Bois. Okay. So we start with these three texts. So if you go to the next slide, we're gonna look at these three texts, either written by Du Bois or about Du Bois. The first one is The Souls of Black Folk. So I'm pretty sure you probably heard it. If you have not heard it, then yes, you should hear it. And if you are planning to move forward in sociology with your master's or even anthropology work or anything of that nature, study race, I don't know, even if you're not, you just need to have this book. Souls of Black Folk is absolutely one of the seminal books of the 20th century period. So any scholar should have this text in their library. Souls of Black Folk, Scholar Denied, is a piece, again, written by Alden Morris, but it is a book about Du Bois that does its just due of putting Du Bois in the top of among the greats who, in terms of our discipline, as one of the fathers of sociology. And then Dark Water is a collection of essays by Du Bois that expands his thought process, expands his analysis outside of the American Negro, outside of the African American, and expands his analysis to the world. And so now he's taking some of these same ideas around double consciousness, ideas around psychological wage of whiteness, which we're going to talk about, and he expands that into a global context, and he talks about global capitalism and ways in which we can do, and because now he's running into a time period, this is the early 20th century, where colonialism is running rampant, particularly on the continent of Africa. And so he addresses that in Dark Water in one chapter called Hands of Ethiopia. And so we're going to talk about that as well. So those are the three texts by Du Bois that we're going to go into. So first one, Souls of Black Folk written by Du Bois. And before we go into the text, just going to give you a quick background of who W.E.B. Du Bois is. Du Bois was born, I believe, in 1868. So in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, he was born a free man of mixed race heritage. He was very, very light skinned. And W.E.B. Du Bois was raised with a certain amount of privilege, for sure. He was definitely Black, and he identified as Black. He looked Black, even though he was very light. He looked Black, and but he would probably be considered more middle class, right? So he definitely had advantages that a lot of Black people in his time did not have. At the same time, he also understood very early how his Blackness and how his race played a role in the way in which he was able to navigate society, particularly around his interactions and interrelationships with white women or with white girls as he's growing up. So he, likes girls and he wants to date them. And there was one, he talks about this in a biographical kind of way in one of his texts, where he talks about how he wanted to ask this girl to a dance at his school. And he soon realized through the way she interacted with him and from the responses from the people in the community that was not right, that he could not be seen publicly with this girl on a date. I want to say they might have been like in middle school or would have been considered middle school at this time. And so that always stuck with Du Bois. And so even when he moved on into high school and eventually college, where he attended Fisk University, which was and is still an HBCU in Tennessee, he always remembered how he felt when he was rejected by this young girl that he really liked. And understanding more and more the ideas around race and what race means, going to an HBCU, going to a historically Black college, he began to gain a much deeper understanding about his own culture and his own identity as a Black man. And so after that, Du Bois would go on to, he would eventually go to Harvard. And Harvard is where he would attend school and would eventually get a PhD from Harvard and be the first Black person to get a PhD from Harvard. He wasn't the first one to graduate, though, I don't believe, but he was the first one to get a PhD from Harvard. Also, while he was studying at Harvard, he also, lived, I want to say he lived in Germany, he lived overseas for a while. And as he's overseas, as he's learning in the States and as he's learning overseas, he is starting to understand this new discipline called sociology. And he's starting to take a liking to it. Now, he's studying history. He got his PhD in history, but he's starting to take an interest in this new budding discipline called sociology. And so he's over there and he's talking to Weber and he's learning from Marx and he's learning from all of these different scholars and philosophers about why things happen the way they do in society, particularly in this much more industrialized world that we're living in. So we're talking about this is happening in like the latter part of the 19th century. So the Industrial Revolution is well underway. This is when you really start to get big cities, right? And I believe we talked about that before, but this is where you're really starting to get more of the bigger cities, right? These huge metropolitan cities, Philadelphia and New York and all these different places, right? And so he's beginning to understand cities and he's beginning to understand people and particularly capitalism, because that's all everybody's talking about in Germany. They're talking about economics and capital, right? So that's the big thing. And so Du Bois is listening and he's paying attention and he's saying, okay, they're talking about capital and capitalism. But one thing that they're missing in this conversation, they're not talking about race. And I don't even think they really even understand how race is a central focus of capitalism, right? Nobody's talking about that. Marx has written volumes and volumes of books. Capital is I had to read it for grad school. It's really, really, really long. I think he may mention the Negro or Black once, maybe twice that I saw. And that was just in one of the volumes. So Marx is not dealing with race. And that's one of the critiques around Marx. Granted, maybe that wasn't as big of an issue in Germany at the time. So it wasn't a big deal. And he was thinking about where he was, right? In other places in Europe, racial interactions and racial tensions were not as big or did not exist in the same way, and were not as in your face as they are in the United States. And so that is what Du Bois said, hey, I can add this piece into this discipline because these people are not talking about it. These people are not dealing with race and seeing the significance of race as a central part of global exploitation, right? So he comes back to the States. And when he gets back to the States, he finishes up at Harvard. And then he does a study, I believe it was his dissertation on Black farmers particularly, but Black folks in Farmville, Virginia, right? And this is where he's starting to study race, right? Race and economics. Then after that, he gets a job, I want to say, was it at Oberlin College? Maybe. Might have been Oberlin College or a college in Ohio. I want to say he got a job there. It wasn't easy for Du Bois to get a job because of his race. He was denied often, even though he had a PhD from Harvard. It was very, very difficult for him to find a job. But I want to say he ended up getting that job at Oberlin College as a professor. And then after that, or while he was doing that, he also got funding for his research that would later be the Philadelphia Negro. Philadelphia Negro is another book that is absolutely important for you to have in your library if you are a sociologist, particularly if you're studying race. So the Philadelphia Negro is another text, or his first, I would probably say, major study. Received funding for it. And what he did was he studied race and class and economics in Philadelphia, which would have been considered like a Black Mecca at that time. It was the place that had this very beautiful kind of interclass Black community where you had poor, working class Black folks, middle class Black folks. Philadelphia was a central point and a significant place for Black folks who were running from the South during slavery to the North. Harriet Tubman absolutely brought Black folks when she was helping enslaved Black people to get free. From the South to the North, Philadelphia was a key stop when Philadelphia, for lack of a better term, got hot. Then they would go to New York, and when New York got hot, then they would go to Canada. And so Philadelphia was a place where Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists set up their camps. And a lot of the abolitionist work and a lot of the anti-slavery work was done out of Philadelphia. So Philadelphia is a very, very important place for Black people. And so after slavery, many Black people moved there and migrated there. And that's where a lot of them got jobs and were educated. And so it's a very, very significant place. And so this is where Du Bois did his work. And in doing his work, he came up with concepts and ideas that he would later on put into this piece, The Souls of Black Folk. So he finished his study on Philadelphia Negro and got that published right before the 20th century. And then this piece was published in 1903. And so Souls of Black Folk is a compilation of essays and concepts and ideas around race that really set the stage for how sociologists for the next 120 something years would study race. We take a lot of it and use Souls of Black Folk as that foundation. And so then from there, he gets a job in Atlanta. He moves to Atlanta and begins to teach in the Atlanta University Department of Sociology. It is in Atlanta where he starts to train other sociologists, particularly Black sociologists. It is in Atlanta. It is here where he really begins to expand his research repertoire. And so this is where you see research from him on the Black middle class. This is where you see research, all types of research from Du Bois coming out of Atlanta and his training for other students. Then soon he will move to Harlem, where he will start the Crisis magazine. He will get involved with the Harlem Renaissance. There, he will find his way back to Atlanta. He became a communist. He started to do a lot of government work. He was also doing work on the continent in Ghana. He was doing a lot of work in, globally as well. Very, very politically active. And then eventually, after he felt as though the United States was no help, and this was late in his life, maybe in his 80s, not 1980s, but when he was around 80 something years old, he just saw that there was really no hope. It just didn't seem like America was going to get any better. In fact, it seemed like it was only getting worse. And so he decided to move to Ghana, and he spent his last years in Ghana, and he died. I believe it was August 27th, I believe, don't quote me, which I always like to say he died the day before Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. So I like to think of it as Du Bois passing that mantle on to Dr. King, who would continue that fight. So with that being said, what we're going to talk about today is specifically Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk and his social constructionist views around race. So the first thing that Du Bois does and how he starts off Souls of Black Folks is he says, to the real question, how does it feel to be the problem? Right? Who is he talking to in this? How does it feel to be the problem? And in this question, when you're thinking about somebody asking someone a question, it is the question, and then who is the audience? Okay. And so the audience is Black people, it's Black folks. How does it feel to be the problem? But there's a second audience to this question as well. Because remember, he's writing this in the latter part of the 19th, earlier 20th century, right? And if you read, or if you read Souls of Black Folk, even now it's still not an easy read. Even now you have to be educated in order to understand a lot of what he's saying. So he can't just be talking to Black people, because a majority of Black people during this time were uneducated. Sharecroppers, farmers, very little to no formal education. Not to say that they weren't smart, brilliant people, very intelligent, but just not formally educated. So it's highly unlikely that they would get this book and read it. So he's talking to Black people, but he's talking to the Black educated people, very small percentage of the Black population. Would he write a whole book, and such a significant book, just for them to read? No, not just them. But he's also talking to white people in this book, particularly the white elite. And so he's talking to Black folks with the white people there, telling them, how does it feel, Black people, to be the problem? But he's also looking at the white folks, how does it feel for them to be the problem? And then he says, why did God make me an outcast, a stranger in my own house? He's talking to the Black people, with white people listening, knowing that the white elite is listening, because he's trying to change Black folks' mind, but he's also talking to them saying, I need y'all to listen to what I'm getting ready to say. Number one, these people are outcasts and they're strangers in their own homes. What does he mean by that? He means that these people are marginalized people, are people that have been pushed to the side, that have been forgotten in the building of this country, in the building of a house where they put in the labor. You would not have this country. You would not have this powerhouse, this superpower, right? This is coming right before World War I, or in what, probably shortly after the Spanish-American War. You wouldn't have what you have if it were not for these people. These people built this house, and yet they're strangers in their own homes. So how does it feel for these people to be the problem? How does it feel for these people to be strangers in their own house, to be strangers in their own country? And then on top of that, being stripped from another country, stripped from another continent, so they don't feel or identify with that either. How does this feel? And so in Souls of Black Folk, he places Black people under a petri dish, and he is taking apart, essentially, and assessing the identity negotiations that are going on with African Americans. One of the first things he talks about is this notion of the veil. The veil. And he calls this veil a gift on page 38. And he says that this veil allows Black folks to exist in a world that yield him no true self-consciousness, but only allows him to see himself through the revelation of the other world, through the revelation of another world. So essentially, this veil is Black people only having one particular way, or not one, but a unique way in which they have to look at this world. Very unique in comparison to white people. And I think a good example would be this scenario. You have a male, a white male, and he's getting ready to go outside. But as soon as he gets ready to go out, it starts raining. And he has to walk somewhere. So he goes back into his apartment, his house, his dorm, goes to look for an umbrella. But he can't find one. Goes to look for a poncho. Doesn't have a poncho. He goes in his closet and he sees a hoodie. And he has a hoodie. Matter of fact, he has a big hoodie that he can just put over his head and walk where he's going. So the white male puts on the hoodie and he walks. And you know how it happens when it rains sometimes. It starts raining and it's pouring down, and 5 seconds later, the sun is shining. So that's what happens. So he's walking, going to where he's going, coming back. No second thought. Same scenario, but it's a Black man. Same scenario. Okay. And he goes to his closet, gets ready to put on that hoodie, and then thinks. He stops. The white male didn't stop, but he stops. Why is he stopping? He's stopping because his veil now kicks in. He's stopping because he knows I can't just look at myself as how I would look at myself, which is essentially just my Black male putting on this hoodie so that I don't get my head wet. But he also has to think about, well, what if it stops raining? And if it stops raining and the sun is out, but I have this hoodie on, what are people going to think? And not just anybody, but what would certain people think? Am I going somewhere where I'm going to see and interact with white people? Am I going somewhere where I could possibly get harassed or asked questions by the cops and they see me in this hoodie? So now I have to think twice before I wear it. I can wear it, but I'm wearing it at my own risk. I can wear it, but now I have to think, if I take it off, or if the sun comes out, maybe I need to bring my book bag with me so I can take this hoodie off and put it in my book bag so I'm not wearing a hoodie. And at least that might decrease the chances of me not completely taking it away, but decrease the chances of me being harassed by the police, being seen as a gangster, or whatever. So all of these things are things that Black folks have to think about that white folks typically don't. And this is why Du Bois has, and we're going to the next slide, this thing called double consciousness. Now, I had you all look at Cooley's looking glass self versus double consciousness. And before we get into that, because that was your discussion, and before we get into that, I want to say I did grade, talk a little bit about your grades. I did grade your first, for your Juneteenth assignment, right? Where you all were looking at Walker's appeal, you were looking at Douglas's what to the slave is the 4th of July, and you were associating that with Juneteenth. And some people's papers I was impressed by. And I really like the way that you grappled with that. A majority of them I thought could have been better. I could tell that, or it didn't appear that there was a lot of thought put into it. And so what I really want to see, especially with this being an online distance learning class, is really the only way that I can really get to know you is through your writing. And the only way I can get to know how you're grappling with these words and with the text and with the readings is through your writing. Unless you log into my office hours or you set up a time to meet with me, and then we can discuss, which some of you have. And so we've been able to have conversations verbally, but if you don't do that, then this is the only way I can tell. And so I'm reading it, and I'm really expecting you all to really dig into this. And a lot of your papers didn't seem like they did that. I was actually very lenient on those papers. I didn't grade them as tough as I normally do, but it was because it was the first one. So I just kind of took a step back. But in the future, I'll probably grade, and like I normally do. And so when I ask you to go into detail, I really want you to go into detail. If I ask you to lay the themes out, I want you to lay out the themes, and then I want you to talk about them, not copy and paste, but I want to see that you have an understanding of the major themes. So just like I go into a lot of detail when I'm explaining in the lecture, I want you to go into detail with your assignments. So yeah, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for you, if I have a question that I'm asking you to answer, what do you think this person means when they say that? I don't want you to just give me one sentence. Or if I say, explain the themes of Walker's appeal, some of you gave me one sentence. And I'm thinking that's like a 18 to 25 page document. And even if you didn't read the whole thing, even a couple of pages that I assigned, you can definitely come up with more than one sentence. You should at least come up with a paragraph or two explaining the themes. And I laid out the themes in the lecture. So I was really hoping for more, and I really believe that you all can give me more. And so I'm expecting more, and I'm expecting depth. I'm expecting real depth, and some of you did give me that, and that was good. A lot of you didn't know, and so I'm looking for more. So do that with these next few assignments, and I'm going to grade some of the discussion posts, so I'll look at that as well. And that's what I'll be grading on. So yes, I just thought about that when I was talking about this. So looking glass self, you were supposed to do Cooley, look at that and compare that to Du Bois's double consciousness. And so when we look at Cooley's looking glass self, and the reason why I like to do this is because it shows how everything builds on top of each other. So Du Bois didn't completely make up double consciousness. And I know some people like to say that, but it came from Cooley, right? Cooley had this same idea. And if we look at looking glass self, what were they saying? What was Cooley, how did Cooley explain this looking glass self? He said that the looking glass self was the process in how individuals would base their sense of self and how they base their sense of self on the way others believe them to be. And so it was broken down into 3 stages. The first stage is how we as individuals, we imagine how we are supposed to appear to others, right? And then the second stage, we imagine the judgment of that appearance. And then the third stage is we develop ourself through the judgment of others. So you can almost look at it as stages in ages, right? When you're young, you're in elementary school and middle school, maybe even high school, how your peers feel about you, how your parents feel about you, how your teachers feel about you, those things are very important to you as a child, right? And even as a teenager, right? Whoever you're interested in, whether you're interested in boys, whether you're interested in girls, what they think about you, if you have a boyfriend, if you have a girlfriend, those things are important to you. How people look at you is important to you. That's part of your looking glass self developing. After a certain time, or while you're doing that, you're thinking to yourself, how are people going to judge me if I wear these clothes, if I talk this way, if I listen to this music, right? If I date this person, if I hang out with these people, how are people going to judge me? And all of that shapes how you behave. Again, part of the looking glass self. So that's the second phase. So we imagine the judgment of that appearance. We imagine the judgment throughout a good portion of our lives, kids, teenagers, maybe even in your 20s. But as you get older, as somebody who's not in their 20s anymore, as you get older, you start to develop your own sense of self. And through the judgment of others, you either do one of 2 things. You either continue to live your life in that way, and you can. Some people live their whole life worried about what other people think. Or through that judgment, you start to say, you know what? I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to do what I want to do, right? And so that's the third stage, and hopefully that's the final stage. Hopefully that's the stage that a person gets to, right? But essentially, those are the stages of the looking glass self. How people look at you determines who you feel like you need to or want to be. And so when we look at that, we see double consciousness is very much like that, except for the way that Du Bois explains it, it's not as innocent. It's not as innocent as, oh, I'm getting picked on in school. Though bullying is not an innocent thing, for sure. But this idea, he's kind of saying, is more than a looking glass self. And it doesn't have as much to do with how you feel about yourself as a human being, as much as how you can survive the world. And he's saying with double consciousness, Black folks have this looking glass self on 10. Because they have to see themselves not only through the eyes of Black people, but they have to look at themselves through the eyes of white people. What are white people going to think if I do this? Like this Black boy wanting to wear the hoodie. Him wanting to wear it or not wanting to wear it doesn't have anything to do with being bullied. It doesn't have anything to do with him being a teenager and just wanting to fit in. This has everything to do with, am I going to make it back home? Will I get pulled over by the police? Will I be accused of doing something that I didn't do and I get taken to jail? And if I don't have money for bail, I could be in jail for years off of something that I didn't do. That really happened. Look up the Khalif Browder story, whole documentary on it. They had to pass a lot of laws to stop prison officials from putting kids in solitary confinement because of what happened to this boy for a crime that he did not commit. Always having to look at oneself through the eyes of other people. Du Bois says, measuring one's soul by the type of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. He's taking Cooley's looking glass self to a whole nother level. He's saying this is about survival. This is about contempt and pity. Cooley's not taking it this deep. He's talking about Black people who have to look at themselves through the eyes of white people, as white people look on them and look at them as people that they can't stand, people that they hate, people that they despise, but also people that they pity. They're so poor. They're so uneducated. They're so shiftless. They're so uncivilized. And Black folks have to look at themselves through all of these lenses in order to navigate society. This is what Du Bois learned while he was doing the Philadelphia Negro. This is what he realized, all right? He says that Black folks look at themselves as American and a Negro. American because they want to belong to America, but a Negro, a Black person, because there's this whole separate community and a whole separate world that they belong to, that they also identify with. The good thing is, for white folks, is that those two typically won't clash with each other. There's a certain level of acceptance there. For example, if you're a Southern white person, sure, there's a history. You have the Confederacy. There's a long history of being a Southern American that is different from other regions of the United States. Absolutely, no doubt about it. But at the same time, there's an appreciation that American government, American politics has for the southern part of the United States. They wouldn't have gone to war if they didn't. You have Southerners some of them who appreciate the Confederacy and Confederate flag and Southern traditional heritage and pride, and at the same time have no problem with pledging allegiance to the American flag, running for office, sending a Southerner to be in office, to be president. And many Southerners, many Midwesterners have gone on to become president, all right? Or be key political figures. So you can have these two different worlds, like a Southern American. You can be Southern and you can be American, but they don't clash with each other, right? It's just a part of this larger American story. But Du Bois is saying being American and a Negro clash, because a Negro wants to be with their people. A Black person wants to identify with Black people. A Black person wants to identify largely with Africa and being African American. But America clashes with that person because everything that America does and how America was created, and not only created, but what has been done in the past and what continues to be done to America, in a lot of times is at the expense of the masses of Black people. And so what Du Bois is saying is that these two thoughts, these two ideas, these two identities are always at war with each other. And there's only one body, and they're going between feeling like an American and feeling like a Negro, feeling like an American and feeling like African, feeling like American and feeling Black. Wishing that they could all just be one thing, but they're always coming in contact. Do I have more allegiance to my Black side than my American side, or do I have more allegiance to my American side than my Black side? Because they're always at war with each other. Not because they want to be, but because it appears as though with the traditions and the ways and the systems that exist in the United States, it's always at the expense and the exploitation of Black people. And so Du Bois calls this double consciousness, this two-ness, this double identity, this dual identity that Black folks have, looking at themselves through the eyes of white people, always, and now we call it code switching, right? Code switching. where a Black person may pick up the phone, they may talk so-called regular, and they may pick up the phone if they're doing business and put on their white voice, right? And then when they get off the phone, they take off their white voice. Notice I'm putting quotations around this for a reason, but this is what Black people call code switching. Moving in and out of worlds. I can't be like this because that's not accepted, but this is how I really am. But then I also can't talk like this around Black people because then they might not accept me either. So I have to make sure I talk this way. So there's all of these worlds that they're moving in and out of. And this double consciousness is happening so regularly, so naturally that it's just a part of the African-American and Black identity. And so Du Bois goes on to talk about how this double consciousness that has been created by Black people, for Black people, since they came out of slavery, right, is now a part of their overall identity. And it's a part of their search for freedom. Going on to the next slide. It's part of their search for freedom. It's part of their search for identity. It's part of their search of finding a place in this world. And so he goes on to say that Black folks did not just get free after the 13th Amendment, after the Civil War, and say, okay, we're just going to sit here and wait for things to happen for us. No, they went out to try to get it. They said, hey, how can we now integrate into American society? How can we prove to America, how can we prove to this country, how can we prove to these people, white people, that we deserve to be here, that we want to be here, and that we can contribute to this society? Even though they built the country, they still want to show, how can we show even more that we deserve to be here, that we deserve to be citizens? So the first thing Du Bois says they did was that they believed if we vote and we vote well, and we show that we can be a part of this democratic process, this is the thing that sets the United States apart from all other countries, because we believe in the republic. We believe in democracy. We believe in voting for the people, that the people choose power and not some dictatorship, not some totalitarian government, right? So Black folks are saying we can participate in this and we can do this and we can run for office and we can vote. And they begin to vote and vote and vote. That was such a major part of their democratic identity. And shortly after the Civil War, shortly after the 13th Amendment, Black folks begin to have their voting rights infringed upon by the rise of the White Citizens Council, by the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And many of them had crosses burned in their yards and their churches burned and killed when they got ready to vote. Eventually, after Reconstruction, they were denied the right to vote after 1872 or 1876, whenever Reconstruction ended. We're going to talk about Reconstruction in a second. All the way up until 1965. So for another almost 100 years, they couldn't vote. So Du Bois is saying they tried. They tried to prove that they didn't have to just be Black American or African, that they could just be part of the American society. And you stopped them. So he said, okay. Well, he's saying Black folks said, okay, if we can't do it through voting, let's do it through education. Let's show that we can gain equality by being the most educated people in this country. And that's exactly what they did. Through the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a set of resources that were put aside to help integrate shortly after the Civil War, to integrate Black folks into American society. Through those resources, through the Freedmen's Bureau, historically Black colleges and universities were started. Loans were given to Black folks to open up their own businesses. Loans were given to Black folks, well, a lot of white folks who started schools for Black people. Northerners, particularly Northern women teachers, were coming down South to educate these people called freedmen, these newly freed Black people. And so they began to educate themselves. And they became some of the more educated people in the country. Frederick Douglass, Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, etc. But then You had Jim Crow, you had segregation, you had separate but equal. And so with segregation and Jim Crow, that stopped those same opportunities that Black people had for educational advancement than white people had. So Du Bois is saying they believed in voting, thought that would be the key to equality. Then they tried education, but at last he said it was not fair. He goes on then to move on to a more economic analysis. And he says to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the bottom of hardships. This is where he starts to, he's kind of playing with thinking more broadly outside of the US context, and he really goes into it when he goes in the hands of Ethiopia. But he says to be a poor man is hard. It's hard enough to be poor. It's hard enough not to have any money. But if your whole entire race is poor, in a land where so many people that are not a part of your race are rich, that's the bottom of hardships. But he's saying that means that there's not something wrong with the people, there's something wrong with the system. There's not something wrong with these people. If you're telling me that 16 million people who are poor, this whole entire race is poor, even the middle class is poor, because poverty is not just about lack of financial resources, it's also about lack of opportunities, lack of access. You can be politically poor if you can't vote properly. You can be socially poor or culturally poor if your culture and your social interaction is robbed, your social networks are robbed from you based on policies, based on traditions, based on the criminal justice system. So you can be poor in other ways, not just by not having any money, right? So he's saying to be a poor man is hard, but for your whole entire race to be poor, he calls it later on the proletarianization of a race. For your whole race to be proletarianized, for your whole race to be brought into this poor and working class group in a land where there's so much money and so many resources, especially after this industrial revolution, that's the bottom of hardships. That puts you in a worse situation than someone who's living in a so-called third world country. At least in a third world country, if you're poor, the whole country's poor. But here, you're poor in a land of dollars. That's the worst. And so he says, a people thus handicapped ought not to be asked to race with the rest of the world, but rather allowed to give all its time and thought to its own social problems. So what he's saying is, white people, you're telling these Black folks, all right, listen, we understand everything before the Civil War. We get that. You were enslaved. That was our fault, right? But now it's over. We gave you the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. We got the Freedmen's Bureau. You got schools. Your churches are thriving. You got equal rights. You're a citizen now. You can vote. Well, we took that back too, but you can go to school. Well, we put you in separate schools and we didn't give it as much funding as we gave white schools, but you still got schools, right? What's the problem? Why can't you all come up? Why can't you all be better? Why can't you all do better? Why don't you have any money in your communities? Why can't you build your own? Du Bois is saying, well, first of all, you didn't put them on equal footing. They're still at a lesser, they're still at second-class citizenship in compared to white folks. That's number one. And number two, the prejudice and the discrimination has not stopped. In fact, it has continued, and you've taken the same parameters around enslavement and you place them in other ways. Now, instead of race, it's all about class. So you keep these people at a disadvantage, you keep them poor, you keep them working without the same opportunities as other people, you lower the competition, then you increase the mobility of one race and you decrease the mobility of another race. And then you expect them to be able to keep up with the Chinese. You expect them to be able to keep up with the Indians. You expect to be able to keep up with the Europeans. You expect them to be able to keep up with every other group in the world. And you haven't given them enough space and opportunity to solve their own social problems that you created for them. In essence, what he's saying is the idea around race should not be an individual one anymore. You need to think about this as a social group construction, a problem of race that you created. And it is more than just individual discrimination. There's an entire system of discrimination that has been put in place that I've shown you that has now affected these people psychologically, that has caused them to have this double consciousness, and has caused the rise of one race and the impeding of another race. And so his argument is that you need to allow, number one, stop the discrimination, and then allow these people to fix their own problems so that once they have an equal footing, now you can ask the question, why can't you get it together? Why can't you race with the rest of the world? Give them the time and the space to allow them to do that. And so with that being said, I want you to watch this, this video. It's called the Unequal Opportunity of Race video. And after that, I'm going to present to you some critical thinking questions, right? That I want you to just kind of ponder in your mind. So let me go ahead and start. So I want you to watch this, and then we're going to think about some questions. Okay. So after watching this video, let's go to the next slide. Couple critical thinking questions, okay? Number one, what did you take away from this video? All right, what messages did you receive? I want you to think about that. What were some of the key points? What do you think the author, or not the author, but the person creating the video was trying to relate to you? Secondly, do you agree with the ideas the video was putting forth? They had a message in the end, talked about affirmative action. Obviously, that's not what the entire video is about, but it is a video that helps to support this larger idea as to why affirmative action can be necessary or is necessary. But in addition to that, some of the other ideas around more structural notions around racism, and how discrimination exists in all of these different sectors of society. How did white women play a role in the race? So you saw at the very end, there was a white woman who was running in the race, and there was the white male who was on the, thing, finishing in the finish line, and the white woman was running behind them. What does that mean? Because that's significant too. What does that mean? And then what systemic racist issues did you see in the video that still exist today? All right. So the video was created some years and years and years back, but do these things still exist today? The same ones that they talked about in the video, but then also maybe even some different ones. Right, so these are just some questions that I want you to think about. Feel free to, email them to me if you want to, or, just talk about it with me during office hours. Just some kind of questions to critically think about when discussing this more structural forms of race and racism, but then also to help us see that this is the way that Du Bois expounded on our view of race through his research. And he was actually the first scholar to ever do that, right? In a formal way. He was the first scholar to do that. All right, let's go to the next slide. The scholar denied, W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay, so let's move on. So we're talking about the scholar denied. And before we go into that, I first want to start with talking about race again from a scientific perspective. We don't have to go into this too deep because this is a sociological theory class, and I assume you all know this for sure, that there's no biological basis for race, right? So we don't have to go too deep into that, because I don't think you would be taking this class if you didn't understand that race is a social construction. So we get that part, right? Race is a social construction because race is not something that's biological. You cannot determine somebody's race solely based on their genetics, solely based on the way they look biologically, but it is something that has more to deal with, or it is more so aligned with the type of policies, the type of laws and behaviors that people use and assign to someone's racial category, right? Once a person's racial category has been solidified, then there's a certain treatment, there's certain policies, there's a certain level of equality and inequality that person experiences because of this racial category, but it has nothing to do with what is happening to them biologically, right? So that's why we call it a social construct. We also call it social construct because it is something that changes over time. Race means something differently in different eras. It means something differently in different states. It means something differently in different countries. So that's why we also call it a social construct. Depends on what society you're in, depends on what's happening around you. That will then determine how race affects your life. Okay. Going on. So we present again a much more socially constructionist view of race in that we look at it as a social construction. We just talked about how Du Bois and Du Bois's double consciousness was a key way in which we begin to understand how race is a social construction, but also how it affects people psychologically and how it affects the way that they can negotiate their identity, not only with themselves, not only with people that look like them, but also people that don't look like them, right? And so this notion of double consciousness was what really helped to move Du Bois further into this discipline. Now he's looked at as a theoretician. He's coming up with this theory. This theory is now being tested. People are writing essays on this theory, and he's also looking at the lens of Black folks and race in general through this theory of double consciousness. In addition to that, Du Bois also not only provides a race analysis in understanding society and understanding American society, he also provides a class analysis. And he talks about, and one thing I love about Du Bois is he's not going to present a problem without at least trying to present some sort of solution. And so one of the things that he says with the issue of race in this country, and obviously he puts a lot of the onus on white folks because white folks created race and white folks created racism. So he's saying you need to do something to help these people, to help this group become more equal and be able to race with the rest of the world. In addition to that, he's also telling Black people, and so you saw this as well when we were looking at Walker and when we were looking at Douglas, they had charges for white folks and they also had charges for Black folks. And so Du Bois is telling Black people, hey, there's also a group among you. There's an educated few in your group that can help Black people get to a certain level of freedom, or at the very least, be able to improve their social condition. And he called this group the Talented 10th. And the reason why he called them the Talented 10th is because they were the 10% of the population that was educated. So Du Bois was not the only educated Negro of his time, right? There were, I mean, you had people like Elaine Locke, you had County Cullen, you had Langston Hughes, you had Zora Neale Hurston, you had so many other African Americans who had gone to college, who got master's degrees in anthropology or political science or whatever. Some had PhDs, very successful, right? And so he's saying this group, essentially people like him, this group, this talented 10th, the small 10% of the population, these are the people that's going to lead Black folks into the future. This is what's going to lead them into mobility. This is what is going to help increase the status of the colored person, the Black person in America. This is the talented 10th, right? Some people looked at it as a very elitist idea. And it maybe in some ways it was. But I think it was his way of dealing with the also nuanced ways in which class and education also differentiated Black folks from each other. And maybe now we can look at it as a little bit more elitist because there's more education. We're living in a post-civil rights era. So there's many more educated Black people, many more middle-class Black people than there were during his time. So maybe he had a point. Maybe we can give him a break. I don't know. Some people may say, no, he was still an elitist. All he wanted to do was just find some fancy name to put with him and his friends and make themselves the leader of Black folks. I don't know. It's your opinion, right? But this was his approach, right? And again, the reason why was because he was trying to find a way to help offset this inferior attitude that white people had about Black folks and that Black people had about Black folks. And during his time, a lot of scholars believed that Black people, again, were racially inferior, and their current social status didn't have a lot to do with the institutional racism. So that's where we got the double consciousness and essentially souls of Black folk, which helped to offset the scientific racism of that time. There's a lot of scientific racism that said that Black people were naturally inferior, they had smaller heads, they came from uncivilized Africa, they were running with monkeys and they were cave people in Africa. They lived outside, they were walking around naked. And so this is why they needed to be civilized, right? All of this scientific racism, okay, definitely historical racism, because none of that was true. Even in places where people wore less clothing, usually it was some cultural significance there. And many of those people that wore less clothing came from villages, tribes, people that were incredibly rich with gold and oil and resources and all kinds of things, right? And had been trading with other countries for centuries and centuries and centuries, and had knowledge and academic knowledge that far exceeded a lot of the Europeans even at that time. So that was not true, right? Unfortunately, though, this was the idea that was taught in a lot of the American schools. And so this led to what we call scientific racism. And because scientific racism thought that Black people were naturally inferior to white people, scholars felt that when Du Bois, and this is what you'll find in this text, and also you'll find it in the Souls of Black Folk too, I think in another chapter, he called Black people primitive and childlike and in need of guidance. And he adopted this train of thought. But later on, we're going to find out exactly what he meant. But that's what he called Black people, childlike. And so it almost kind of feeds into this talented 10th idea, right? It kind of feeds into, oh, well, we're the educated ones. And the other 90% are childlike and are shiftless and are uncultured. But he goes further, right? So we talked about the talented 10, and this idea that, again, slavery left the masses of Black folks ignorant. And when I say ignorant, I mean just uneducated, non-formally educated, right? And so they needed the more educated Black people to lead the culture and the race into freedom, to lead them into mobility, to lead them to a better understanding. Take this education that they've gotten from Harvard and Cornell and Princeton and University of Chicago and all these different places, and now help come civilize the other 90% of Black people. Again, Du Bois's language and ideas a lot of times appear to lead us. And people would argue with Du Bois and claim that he thought that Black people were inherently inferior, right? This led a lot of Black people to not want to side with Du Bois. And so when other Black leaders will rise up, like Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, and others, you had a lot of Black folks who were more so on that side because they felt Du Bois was elitist or bougie, right? And so this led scholars to argue that he adopted what was called a Lamarckian view of race. And Lamarcky, this Lamarckian view of race dealt with this idea, this scientific idea. And this scientific idea says that organisms, in order to adjust to changing environments, they change their habitual patterns. And then they pass these patterns on to their offspring. So then these characteristics that they pass on become qualities of a population or qualities of people. And so how this relates to early racial theory is that it builds off of this idea. And it builds off this idea that you have these uneducated, uncivilized, right, Black folks that have now had to adjust to their environment. They were in the fields, they were working, they were less than farmers, they were uneducated. And so they had these ways in which they had to force themselves to live. Some of them may have been backwards, right? Some of it may have been seen as not progressive, but they did it to survive. And then they taught their kids how to do it. So even when they had opportunities after slavery, during Reconstruction, because they're so used to behaving in a certain way, they continue to behave as enslaved people, even though they weren't enslaved people. They begin to behave as backwards people, even though they weren't backwards people. Because what was taught to them by their parents and by their grandparents were just survival mechanisms of what they had to deal with. And so it's almost as if there is more of a cultural explanation of this backwards or childlike behavior than there is a biological one. Some people may say it's not really any different. You're saying, okay, it's not biological that they're childlike, it's cultural, but you're still saying that it's something inherent inside of them. And so then this moves us from the idea that Blacks are naturally and biologically deficient to the belief that it was not their nature, but deficient traits that left them as being second-class citizens. And so Alden Morris states that it would take years of an altered environment to change these outcomes. And a lot of research states that because of unfair economic practices, it would actually take 228 years to catch up with white wealth if the playing field was leveled. 228 years. So it takes years to be able to change people's practices, and then that become inherent into how people behave. So it takes years for these practices to actually happen. And then even again, if you level the playing field, this is how deep the wealth disparity is. If you level the playing field and made everything equal, after that day, it will still take 28 years for Black people to actually catch up with white people in terms of wealth. So the question then remains, is Du Bois saying that there is a biological explanation for this notion of race? Right? And this is, this is just an example of the white wealth, Black and white wealth gap we were just talking about. So if we go to the next slide, we see that Du Bois, when he talks about race, Du Bois believes that race was not biological, but that race was something that was constructed off of power, discrimination, and entrenched oppression. And so Du Bois argues that the social dynamics were the best indicator of race and race relations. It wasn't biological, and it wasn't even cultural. And so again, this shows us that there is this social construction around why race exists. And he does a very good job of explaining this in Philadelphia Negro, and so is the Black folk, and then even in Black Reconstruction, where he shows the rise of Black people once those oppressive barriers have been lifted, and then what happens afterwards when you put them back in. And even just that short amount of time in Reconstruction, from like 65 to 72 or something like that, or 76, I think it was like 12 years. Okay, we also talked about how Du Bois sometimes characterized Black people as backwards. So that's the question. Why did Du Bois label Black people as backwards people? And sometimes he characterized Black people as backwards in a way of explaining how society has forced them to adopt an unfair system. If you're put into this environment, if you're put inside of a system, if you're put inside of conditions and where you have to behave a certain way in order to survive, you have to behave backwards in order to survive, then that's what you're going to do. Not because these people are backwards inherently, not because they're inherently ignorant. Many times they're backwards because you have not allowed them to progress. You say you create schools, but these schools don't have the same opportunities as these other schools, and then you don't give them the opportunity to attend the schools that they have proven to you that they can keep up with. Not until college, right? Then you have the HBCUs and that sort of thing. But that's even if they're able to get to college. So you've created these oppressive barriers that label them oppressive barriers, and I'm labeling them as backwards, not because they're backwards, but because you have backed them up. And so the social constructionist language did not exist. So he's using more of these kind of biological racist ideas towards lower achieving Black people. A lot of the social constructionist language he began to create through his books. Now we wouldn't necessarily call Black folks backwards people or shiftless people or uncivilized. But this was the language that they understood, because remember, he's writing to Black people, but he's also writing to white people, even the liberal white people, even his friends, Max Weber and all these people who aren't as racist, but still racist. So he has to literally ease them into them understanding themselves. And Weber would later on appreciate Du Bois and show love to Du Bois and acknowledge Du Bois publicly for how Du Bois changed his ideas around race and class, Protestantism, everything, religion, through his writings. Let's see. So again, some people say he did this because he was arrogant, this idea about backwards people, and he wanted personal recognition from white people to show that he was an exception to the biological rule. Some people believe that Du Bois, because he graduated from Harvard and he had all these fancy Harvard friends, and he was all over in Germany, and he knew some of the greatest scholars of the world, that he was trying to impress them by saying, yes, these shiftless, uncivilized Black people, yeah, they're like this, but I'm the exception. I'm the exception to the rule, which is why I got a degree from Harvard, blah, blah, blah. But again, he's not saying that. He's stating that these people are backwards because they are the subject to labor exploitation. This labor exploitation that's found in a capitalist society, regardless of a person's race. And the treatment and conditions of these workers are tied directly to racial prejudice. So again, we talked about this earlier. Du Bois is adding this racial element to capitalism that no one else was doing. And he's connecting these larger systems of finance, these larger systems of industry, directly to their most beneficial and most prized commodity, which is race. And he's saying that, again, these treatments of these workers and the level of exploitation and the level of profit that is had within these capitalist systems is directly tied to prejudice. Because of race, wages were able to diminish for low-paid workers. Bodies were able to be controlled in that they could not enter into certain social spaces. They could not enter into certain schools. They could not enter into certain jobs that would have allowed them to rise and then create more competition, right? It doesn't mean that people wouldn't get rich, but there's some level of competition there. So you take away rights so that they don't enter certain spaces. You diminish their abilities and what would be considered their social worth. So you pay them lower. You don't give them justice, which literally mirrored the untouchable caste systems of Italy and India. And then, unlike exploited workers of other races, there was no way of getting out of this status. So you put these people in a lower class status, and then you make it a caste by making it no way for them to get out. So not only was this economic and racial, but it was also political, because now on top of this, there are policies and there are political dealings that are done to ensure that this subordinate status continues from generation to generation to generation. Yes, you have people like Du Bois. Yes, you have people like Langston Hughes. Sure, you have people like Elaine Locke or Zora Neale Hurston or Anna Julia Cooper, but that is 4 or 5 out of millions. You can't take those few and say, look, we give opportunities. No. That's not justice. That's not righteous. And it's not democracy. And so what he's saying is that you have to look at, if we're going to talk about capitalism, And if we're going to talk about class, you have to look at race as a key part of this analysis. And if you don't look at race and the ways in which race has been politicized, then you're missing the mark. You can talk about it all day, but you're never going to come to a complete conclusion. You're never going to come to any viable solutions. Okay. Moving on to Du Bois' sociological imagination. So Du Bois then uses history to explain race as a social construct. Okay. He uses his sociological imagination, remember? And if, did we talk about it in this class? Probably not. I don't know if we did. But with sociological imagination, you all should be familiar with that. C. Wright Mills, the sociological imagination is the relationship between biography and history, right? So people's life, and then what is happening historically and socially that fits into their life, right? And so history and what is happening in the larger society plays a huge role in how people understand their life story. So what historical event did early sociologists use to explain life? We talked about this earlier on, and that was the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was what Du Bois used, what Marx and Weber used to explain why life was a certain way for certain classes of people, not only in Germany and in Europe, but also in the United States. So what historical event did Du Bois use to explain life outcomes for Black people and social relationships between Black people in the world? He used slavery and he used Reconstruction. He talks about both of these things, right? And again, later on, Max Weber, would, another classical sociologist, would use race to explain his social relationships. So Du Bois uses the sociological imagination, and that's why he writes, again, books like Black Reconstruction and others to help make sense of the current conditions of Black folks at that time. And so then, this is the question that was brought up in Souls of Black Folks. It comes up again here in the Scholar Denied. How soon after bondage can we expect African Americans to reach equal status with white people? Well, he's saying, first of all, first generation following slavery was not free structurally or culturally. These people still couldn't be themselves. You still had policies that kept them at a disadvantage, only maybe for 12 years. And then after that, you reenacted Jim Crow. Then on top of that, you perpetuated that through economic and social domination. You created laws to where they couldn't go into these places. They couldn't do this. They couldn't do that. They couldn't vote. They couldn't get the same quality of education. And if they tried to, they would be lynched. They would be arrested. They would be fined, which furthered the economic and social domination, forcing these people to adopt backwards cultural traits that they had to use to negotiate their lives and negotiate their beings during slavery. And so what he's saying is that these same kind of oppressive barriers that you said you lifted in 1865 after the Civil War, you just reinstated in different ways. The domination has not stopped. But then he also goes on to another economic system that immediately followed slavery, that a lot of people don't like to discuss. Do you know what it is? He talks about sharecropping. And so sharecropping was, instead of it being racialized like slavery, it was based on class, because there were some white sharecroppers, but a majority of your sharecroppers were Black folks. And the white ones that were, they were poor. And so sharecropping said, okay, Black folks, you can be free. You're free. You don't have to work for free anymore. But because they were uneducated, the only thing they could do was work on farms, work on land. They knew how to do it, but now they're getting paid. Okay, so you're going to pay. Now, you don't have your own land, or you may have your own land, but it's very, 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 very small. And so you need money to work that land. Well, in order to work that land, you're going to have to work for my land. Black folks say, okay, well, I was doing that for a number of years anyway. I'll work on the white folks' land. Okay. Now, in order for you to work the land, you're going to need these tools. You're going to have to work at this time, blah, 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 blah. Okay. By the way, you're going to have to pay me to use those tools. Huh? Yeah. You're going to have to pay me to use those tools. And since you don't have the money, whatever you end up reaping, however much corn, however much cabbage, whatever money or resources you end up making, you have to give me a portion of that to pay off you using this land, to pay off you using these tools. After the Black folks got done paying everything that they owed to the landowner, they only had a small amount to live on. That's then what they would take home to feed to the rest of their families. And there's no way of getting out of that. Because if you only have enough just to go to the rest of your family, and that's all you can do, you don't have enough money to save to put your kid through college, or save to own your own land, to move somewhere where you don't have to be a farmer anymore, but now you can work in the factories. You don't have enough to do it. And that sharecropping system kept many African Americans at a financial disadvantage for decades and decades, almost another century. So sharecropping, no voting, no legal protections, no access to proper education made this situation almost exactly like slavery. These factors determine racial inequality, not the inherent racial traits that were found in the Lamarckian viewpoint. And so this is how Du Bois used Lamarckian language to then contrast Lamarckian's view that could be considered biological / maybe biocultural racism. Okay. Let's see. Moving on. He also talked about the cultural effects of slavery and Reconstruction. He talks about the cultural ignorance that was imposed on them, right? And how the Black masses were not culturally inferior, but they were culturally challenged by these historical contingencies. This group was socially and economically deficient, but not only that, they were culturally wounded. They could not express themselves. They could not express their culture in the way that they wanted to. They could not be who they wanted to be. They could not act like men or act like women. If a white man ran into a Black man, he had to immediately lower himself, even if it was in front of his wife or his children. He had to allow a white man to speak to him in a way that normally he would not allow. And he knew that physically he could probably dominate this man, but then he wouldn't live that long unless he ran away. And so there are these psychological ways of imposition that these Black folks are having to deal with, right? Many African Americans during this time also didn't feel connected to the larger continent. They felt like their roots, again, we talked about this earlier with the double consciousness, they felt like their roots were in America since they had been in America for so long. And so Du Bois argued that there was this disconnect from their original culture, their original identity. And that caused them to be crippled regardless of the aesthetics, because they had no culture in which to draw from. The only, or the furthest they could go in terms of their culture was some slave plantation in Georgia, or in Florida, or in Mississippi, or in Arkansas. And so you take culture away from a people, you take someone's identity and someone's origin story away from them, you put them at a disadvantage. So saying that they were culturally ignorant, in need of guidance, was an explanation of the culture that was stolen from them, and not a means of degrading his own people. It was basically what he was saying, it was a consequence of white oppression. And so students of Du Bois also used this same argument and rejected the biological explanations of racism and elevated a racial analysis that was much more sociological. And so he began to teach his students to do the exact same thing. So rejection of Biological explanations during this time were things like survival of the fittest, Darwinism, that basically said that that there was this huge difference in the physical development of the Negro. That Black folks were physically developed differently than white people, and their physical development caused them to be enslaved. This is why they are enslaved. This is why they're backwards. This is why they're culturally ignorant. And Du Bois is saying no. But that sounds crazy, right? Like why would somebody, that doesn't sound like something we would say in the present day. Let's go to the next slide. We say it sounds crazy, but does it really? If you look at these people, right? Michael Phelps, Usain Bolt, you see the gymnastics, USA gymnastics team, you see the USA basketball team. Some people argue that certain races of people have body types that naturally allow them to compete better even in the Olympic Games. Maybe you just watch some of them. Some people say that white people are just naturally better swimmers. Some people say that Michael Phelps has this natural, they say that his torso is longer than most and something, which makes him this freak of nature as to why he's the most decorated Olympian of all time. Okay, some people say that Black folks are naturally better at basketball or naturally better at track. And even in looking at basketball, while most, if not all the players are Black, the coaches are typically white. And so if we look at that, we see that. If you see NBA or even if you see the NFL, most of the players are Black. Most of the coaches, leaders are white. And so some people say that further explains that Black people can play the sport physically, that they're good with the physical part, but they don't necessarily have the intelligence and the strategies to be coaches. White people have the brains and Black people have the bronze. And together, they create this beautiful business, this industry of sports. So again, it sounds bad when we look at it from the Du Bois race, enslaved African perspective, but when we look at it from an athletic perspective, these are things that have been said even in the present day. Let's look at what Jimmy Snyder said. Jimmy Snyder was a sports analyst back in the 80s, 1980s. And he made this comment. He said, the Black is a better athlete to begin with because he's been bred to be that way, because of his high thighs and big thighs that goes up into his back, and they can jump higher and run faster because of their bigger thighs, and he's bred to be the better athlete, because this goes back all the way to the Civil War, when during the slave trade, the slave owner would breed his big Black to his big woman so that he could have a big Black kid. Obviously, this didn't go over well with a lot of people, especially Black people. And he was eventually fired, right? It was shocking, and he was eventually fired. And you can see why, right? That explanation is horrible. It's racist. I don't know. Some people may not see it that way, but you can see why people would be offended, especially if you say something like that on national television. But again, that was back in the 1980s. But let's look at what this person says. This is much more recent. And I want you to think about, are they saying anything different? So I'm going to share this video and we're going to look at it really quickly.
built custom industrial machines in days.
We want to turn that to a book all parents with kids playing sports will want to know about. I loved it. It's called The Sports Gene, Inside the Science of Extraordinary Athletic Performance. I talked to the author, David Epstein, about a headline-grabbing book that he's written. It tackles some of the most controversial, really taboo topics in sports today, including whether nature or nurture makes the best athlete and whether some ethnic groups are better suited to succeed at athletics.
In Kenya, we're used to thinking of all Kenyans as being great runners, but really, when I visited, it's one tiny tribe that makes up 10 to 12% of the population there, the Kalenjin tribe, that produces the vast majority of the good runners. This is a Kalenjin phenomenon, not Kenyan. And one thing that they happen to have is their ancestry is at low latitude, hot and dry climate. They have extremely long limbs proportional to their body size. And that's an evolutionary adaptation for cooling.
So what had been a taboo subject, that certain ethnic groups are genetically predisposed to athletic superiority, really it's more that there's an evolutionary fluke, that there's something that allowed people to get by that then can be applied athletically.
Absolutely, and it means they're worse for some other things. So people with northern latitude ancestry, you and I, Europeans, Michael Phelps, have longer torsos, which is like the long hull of a canoe, so that's better for swimming. He has extremely short legs. Michael Phelps is 6'4", has the same inseam as the guy who holds the world record in the mile, who's 5'9". Those guys wear the same size pants.
And I want to discuss something that a lot of parents watching at home are going to be interested in, the idea of the specialized athlete, the kid who's playing the club, playing year-round, as opposed to maybe someone, say, of my vintage, somebody who played all sports seasonally. What did you find makes the best athlete?
So there's some evidence that in certain sports, gymnastics, some evidence for golf, that early specialization helps. In other sports, it looks like acquiring a range of experiences and skills through your teen years actually benefits athletes later on. You look at a guy like Steve Nash, right? One of the most skilled basketball players who ever lived. Didn't get a basketball until he was 13 years old. Played soccer. So it looks like now that the best thing to do is to sample, find the best fit for your unique genome, and then specialize in the mid-teen years, kind of 15 and 16. That's the pattern that most of the elites have.
Figure out what your skill set is, go find the sport that emphasizes it. It is a fascinating book. We could sit and spend hours on it. We shan't, but it is The Sports Gene. It's by David Epstein. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
So, something to think about, right? Do you think they're saying anything different? Is it the same? Maybe is the sports gene hypothesis better, worse? I don't know. Something to think about. Feel free to respond. You will have an assignment and a discussion assignment later, but not on this particular one right now. Okay. So now we're going to go into Black Reconstruction and the racial wage. So looking at Black Reconstruction and the racial wage. So this one is extremely important because, again, we talked about this earlier, Du Bois uses slavery and Reconstruction as his historical framework for understanding the conditions of Black folks in the latter part of the 19th and then early part of the 20th centuries. So before we get into his idea of Black Reconstruction, and then how the proletarianization of a race or how racialized poverty plays a role into this, the first thing we need to do is talk about what Reconstruction was. Right, so I kind of explained it earlier, explain it again. Obviously, you're familiar with the Civil War, right? The Civil War left the South, and that's where I would say maybe 90 to 95% of Black people in the country lived at the time in the South. So it left the South in disarray, right? We all know that, right? Large parts of Georgia and Florida, Virginia, Tennessee were ruined. And so now that the country was back together again, now that the Confederate states, the Southern states were back a part of the Union, there had to be essentially a reconstructing of society. How do we bring everybody together again? Number one, how do we fix the South? because we burned up so many areas, right, with this war. How do we fix the South? How do we help the South's economy? Also, we have what, 16 million something new citizens that now we have to account for. We have to insert them into the economy. We have to insert them into the educational systems. We have to do something. Not to mention for years, decades, centuries, these people weren't seen as equal to these other people. So now we have to fix that somehow. Now we have to create equality in a place that it didn't exist. And we have to convince now these white Southerners that now these Black folks are going to be with them in the schools and with them in their voting and all these other aspects of American life. So this is going to be difficult. And Lincoln had already set up a Reconstruction plan. He had one in play, and then he was assassinated. So then Andrew Johnson took up the mantle, vice president, now he's president, and he initiated Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was put in place again. It's a large kind of narrative, but particularly around race, it was put in place to help essentially, I don't want to say reinstate because they were never a part to begin with, but in-state or something, Black folks into American life. There was a certain amount of funds that were put aside for Black people to start their own businesses, to go to school. There were Northerners, particularly Northern teachers who came down, Northern women who came down to teach African Americans, K through 12, as well as colleges. So this is how historically Black colleges and universities started to become popular during Reconstruction. It was during Reconstruction that now you have the first African Americans who are African Americans who run for office. I forgot their names. I don't want to mess it up, but there are two particular ones. One in Mississippi, I think another one was in Louisiana. This is where you're seeing Black people vote for the first time, right? So Black people are being involved in the political process. They're being educated. They're opening their own businesses. Now, this is only a few, particularly the ones who are being educated, because again, the vast majority can't afford education. Some of them get scholarships, but again, the vast majority of them are still working on farms, and unfortunately are having to resort to sharecropping. So this happens for a certain amount of time in the South. Now, some people may ask, well, if so many Southerners were racist, how is this able to occur? Well, the reason why is because Northerners, Union soldiers, were sent down South to ensure the safety for Black people. Right? They were paid to live down South and to ensure that Reconstruction occurred, to ensure that the South they were given money to rebuild their roads, to replant their crops, to rebuild their institutions. So there was almost kind of like reparations was given to the South for what the North did during the Civil War. So they were paid to rebuild again. Not only that, but the Union soldiers were there to protect Black folks from being harassed, killed, harmed by racist white people who did not want to see that equality. It didn't always work because it was during this time that the Ku Klux Klan rose up for the first time. It was during Reconstruction. But also, if you know the history of the Klan, the second round of Klan membership, which came about in like 1915, 1917, was actually bigger than it was the first time, probably because those Union soldiers were able to protect Black folks a whole lot more during Reconstruction than they were during Jim Crow. But they did exist, you know, and that's when Nathan Bedford Forrest started the Ku Klux Klan. So, where was I going? Oh yeah. So the Union soldiers protected African Americans from what, 65, whenever Reconstruction started, till about 1876, 1877. So about 12 years for Reconstruction, where there was this small window period where African Americans were starting to see some level of equality, some semblance of American democracy. It was actually a good time for the most part. I don't want to say for the most part, but it was a good time, relatively speaking, from where they had just come from, for Black folks. So the question is, well, what happened? Well, what happened was, as white people began to participate in the political process, and as more and more of them began to vote in Congress, get voted into Congress, get voted to the Senate, they started to gain little by little political power. You come to the election of 1870, I think it was 1876, with Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes would eventually become president. But he only, I want to say he lost by like a small margin. And so what he ended up doing, he needed a few votes to get put over and win the presidency. And so he went to the Southerners, to the Southern politicians, and he struck a deal with them. He said, if you vote for me, I'll end Reconstruction. If you vote for me, I'll remove the Union federal troops from the South, and you can do with the South as you will, if you vote for me to be president. And they said, okay. They threw their votes behind Rutherford B. Hayes. He became president, and immediately he removed the federal troops from the South. And now the South is wide open to Southerners again. And right after that, all of those opportunities for Black folks went away. Okay. So that's essentially what Reconstruction did. And then shortly after that, Jim Crow was informally institutionalized, and then more formally institutionalized in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. So Reconstruction essentially was that. Now, Du Bois makes this argument that Reconstruction was more than just this economic revolution, right? Because that's what a lot of people looked at it as. This economic revolution for America, but also for the South specifically, as this way of re-entering them back into the economy, because so much of their life had been ruined, essentially, and in disarray. And so Du Bois is saying it's more than just that. It was also more than just the next step for racial equality. We just talked about that. But he said Reconstruction was also a labor movement for Black men. It was their way of finding work, finding identity in a country that seemed to be accepting of them. So it's two different labor movements happening in this Reconstruction era. Is the Black labor trying to find its way into the American economy. It's also a labor movement for uneducated white people, because now they're trying to find their purpose in the American economy. They're trying to find their manhood because much of their identity was locked up in slavery, capitalism, cotton, money, land, racial exploitation. That's how they understood their lives. That's how they understood themselves, as being above these people owning land, having resources, and being able to live. And so they lost their land and they lost their labor in the Civil War. So now they're confused. Now they've lost a large part of who they were. Many of these people, if you've seen documentaries or movies about the Civil War, these same people who were extremely rich or wealthy, are now have nothing because of the Civil War, because of the freedom of Black people, relative freedom. And then also he says there's this new Southern economy. So now the Southern economy is less agrarian and now becoming more industrialized. Later on, it'll be called the New South, where you'll see big cities like Houston, Texas, big cities like Chattanooga, Tennessee, big cities like Atlanta, Georgia, that are now not so much becoming rich off of agriculture, but now they're creating industries that are similar and in some ways rivaling New York and Philadelphia and New Jersey in these areas. Okay. Reconstruction, he's saying, is also, it was a search for freedom. For Black people, they're searching for a freedom, or the source of their freedom that they're searching for was in God. The source of the freedom that the poor white people in the planner that they were searching for was, and I think that he's saying this almost in kind of a satiristic kind of way. He's saying they're not searching for freedom. Their freedom is in nothing because it already existed. He said, if anything, the poor whites and the planters are searching for freedom in laziness because they want their slaves back. They want these people to be back enslaved so that they didn't have to work. And so that's what they're looking for in Reconstruction. Everybody's searching for freedom. Black folks are searching for God. White people are searching for their laziness again, the poor white people. And then the rich white people are searching for control over the poor worker, white or Black. They could care less. And so everybody is out on this search during Reconstruction. He's saying the solution to all of this, particularly the solution for the proletariat, the solution for the poor white worker, and the solution for the Black folks is a laboring class unity. If we can bring these people together, if these two groups who really don't differ much from each other, if we can bring them together under some type of class struggle to show them, both of y'all are being exploited. Both of y'all are being mistreated by rich white folks. Both of y'all are being exploited by the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is taking your land, white people. He's not giving you land, Black people. And there's not much difference between the two of you. You're both non-formally educated. There's some things that the Black man can do that the white man can't do because he's been doing it for centuries for free. But then there's access that the white man has that the Black man don't have because he's white. So why don't we work together? Because there's way more poor people than there are super rich people. So if we work together, we can absolutely overthrow them. And this is the solution that Du Bois has. And Du Bois wasn't the first one to have the solution. Bacon's Rebellion. Are you all familiar with Bacon's Rebellion? Bacon's Rebellion stated that, or, well, I don't want to say stated, but Bacon's Rebellion is the story of Nathaniel Bacon and how these, I think it took place in Virginia. There were these Black, you had the Black folks in Virginia at that time, and then you also had the poor whites. And they realized, this story is told again later on in William Julius Wilson's The Decline and Significance of Race, where you have poor whites and you have Black people who realized that. They said, you know what? We're really no different. This was also during the time where all of them were being treated the same. I think this was in the 1700s, I believe. Don't quote me. And so they started to work together. And they came very close. They were almost successful in overthrowing the rich white bourgeoisie in Virginia. And they had to call the militia, the federal government, to send the US Army to come down and knock down the revolt and knock down the rebellion. And after they did that and people died and the rebellion was over, those rich white people got together and they said, whoa, they figured it out. We got to do something. Because if white people start working, poor white people, it's a lot of them, start working with the Black folks, they're going to overthrow us. It's way too many, not even the federal government. If they do this around the country, the federal government won't be able to hold them back. The US Army won't be able to hold them back. So we have to do something. And they begin to instill this notion of the public, or what Du Bois calls a psychological wage of whiteness. And so if you go to page 240 in your textbook, Social Theory, go to the second paragraph. It says, it must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts depended upon their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. Their votes selected public officials, and while this had small effect upon the economic situation, it had great effect upon their personal treatment and the deference shown to them. White schoolhouses were the best in the community and conspicuously placed, and they cost anywhere from twice to 10 times as much per capita as the colored schools. The newspapers specialized on news that flattered the poor whites and almost utterly ignored the Negro except in crime and ridicule. So essentially, this public and psychological wage of whiteness basically was a way in which rich white people increased the status for poor white people, not to the status of a rich white person, but say, we're going to give you a little bit more freedom, make you feel a little bit better about yourself. Okay? Going to make you feel a little bit better. We're going to allow you to have a little bit more freedom. You're not going to feel like you are one of them. You still know you're not one of us, but you still feel like you're better than them. Give you a few jobs. Let your votes count a little bit more. Give you a little bit more respect. So that way you'll say, well, I'm not white, I'm not rich and white, but at least I'm not poor and black. And increasing their status absolutely knocked down any type of future class unity that would exist among Black people and white people on a large scale. All right, now moving on to Hands of Ethiopia. Hands of Ethiopia, which comes from Du Bois's work in Dark Water. Dark Water is a collection of essays that he published, I believe, in the 1930s. And in these collections of essays, he deals with now ideas around race and racism that further expand outside of just the US context. So some of the major themes in Hands of Ethiopia. Now he does a more critical analysis of global capitalism. So everything we've been talking about has been the US context. Now he's going more global. He deals with more of the internal contradiction of capitalism, so the extreme wealth versus the extreme poverty in underdeveloped countries. But then he also does one of his biggest contributions to sociology, which is showing how race is a factor for global industry and white working class markets, right? How race continues to play a role in how white working class people are able to continue to live in an advantage. So in here, he's focusing on Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and not Northern or Southern Africa, because these places where you have a majority, well, not a majority, but a large number of white folks. So it functions a little differently, but he's talking about the sub-Saharan part where the masses of Black people live, right? And so this is what he's focusing on. And he starts off really interesting. He starts off here with this out-migration theory. And he basically just gives this very quick summation of world civilization from early Africa to the present day, or at least his present day. So if you go to pages 43 to 44, or if you're looking on, I don't know if they have the pages on the PDF or Word document that I uploaded, but he basically starts off by, again, this very common anthropological, historical theory that pretty much anything related to modern day human civilization came out of Africa, right? So he says nearly every human empire that has arisen in the world, material and spiritual, have found some of its greatest crises on this continent of Africa, from Greece to Great Britain. As Mommsen State says, it was through Africa that Christianity became the religion of the world. In Africa, the last flood of Germanic invasions spent itself within hearing of the last gasp of the last gasp of the Byzantium, and it was through Africa that Islam came to play its great role of conqueror and civilizer. With the Renaissance and the widened world of modern thought, Africa came no less suddenly with her new old gift, Shakespeare's ancient pistol cries, a future for the world and worldlings base. I speak of Africa in golden joys. He echoes the legend of gold from the days of Punt and Ophir to those of Ghana, the Gold Coast, and the Rand. And so, again, this argument that out of Africa is coming these very, much of what we understand modern civilization, right? And so then he goes on to talk about the transatlantic slave trade and how the transatlantic slave trade robbed Africa of more than just their human labor, right? But that in this, I want to say it's the paragraph after the next one. So it robs Africa of more than just their human labor. Many people talk about how, yes, there was this taking away of a good portion of the Black population in sub-Saharan Africa, but he said it also robbed them of cultural development. To think about how culture could have moved forward, to think about how Black folks have influenced culture in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Great Britain, in South America, and to think what all of that culture could have done in just that one place, in just Africa. So all of that cultural development could have been concentrated in that one place, and it could have brought so much more to the continent. Not only that, but you rob this continent of future government, of a democracy, of a real democracy that would not be covered or hidden by racism and capitalism, right? And exploitation, labor exploitation. You also rob this continent of industry and social life. Think about the industries that could have existed and could have been improved upon had the transatlantic slave trade not existed. And then later on, he says, and then not just talking about the transatlantic slave trade, but now going into neo-slavery and colonialism and how colonialism is neo-slavery. And he goes on to say on page 44, the same page, if you look at the paragraph that says it is scarcely necessary, he says it is scarcely necessary to remind the reader of the essential facts underlying these broad assertions. A recent law of the Union of South Africa assigns nearly 250 million acres of the best of natives' land to 1.5 million whites and leaves the 36 million acres of swamp and marsh for 4.5 million Blacks. In Rhodesia, over 90 million acres have been practically confiscated. In the Belgian Congo, all the land was declared the property of the state. And so in colonialism, part of these racialized policies that kept these people impoverished and at a disadvantage, you also forced millions and millions and millions of them into these few places, this little bit of land, and then the land that they were on, you take that land away from them and you give it to the white colonists who are now occupying Rhodesia and Rwanda and South Africa, and they now have this mass amount of land that they're living on, and there's nowhere near as many of them as it is the Black natives. And so you not only discriminate against these people in policy, in education, in economics, but in place. And when you take people and you force them into these spatialized constraints, what does that do? That increases crime, that increases poor health, that increases poor housing, and that increases generational poverty. And so in The Hands of Ethiopia, Du Bois essentially writes about these very pacifist ways and how the pacifist seeks to organize, not simply in the masses or the masses in the white nations, but in also the Black nations. And we'll remember that no permanent relief can ever come out by just including in this organization the lowest and the most exploited races in the world. And so it is this thrust of the idea that real peace, real solutions to these problems can only be achieved if the same way that this exploitation was done to all people in the world and by a certain group of people in the world to all people in the world, it's going to take all of the nations in an organized fashion to help bring about a sense of peace. Then hopefully the violence and the rebellions that are short term can be justified. And it's interesting because Du Bois is not necessarily saying that the violence and the rebellions are wrong, because he understands why these rebellions exist. These rebellions exist when people are exploited. But he's saying, but maybe there can be a justification for it if we actually get to a place of peace. So Du Bois's war against Europe, right? It's not that he wants war against Europe. He's saying, Europe, you have violently exploited these people. It's natural for them to rise up, but hopefully there can be a justification if at the end of it there is peace. If this is done in pursuit of peace rather than pursuit of violence. And so in the same way, Madison had this same kind of thought, I believe it was James Madison, had the same kind of thought about the United States. James Madison argued that resistance to a disloyal government should and can be resistance with violence. These are early US founders, people who are considered to be founders. And that should not be illegal, because he says, since a government not loyal to those from whom it derives its authority has in fact lost his authority through that infidelity. They lost that authority through that dishonesty, and it is not illegal, or should not be illegal, for the people to defy and to resist that government. And Du Bois is saying, why is it different for Black folks? And it shouldn't be. But if it leads to peace, if it leads to harmony, then it can be justified. And so then he goes on to talk about how, even in the midst of, and going to the next slide, even in the midst of everything that essentially Europe has taken from particularly Africa, and he's given us this global capitalist point of view, and he's talking about colonialism, he says there's something that Europe actually contributed to that same continent. He said Europe gave the Africans education, gave them missionaries, gave them industry. Now, some people may disagree with Du Bois. I would disagree to a degree about some of these things. But he believed that particularly education and the modernizing of education, the modernizing of Africa through education, as opposed to churches and religion, would be the way in which we can help bring about some level of equality. But he believed that Europe gave Africa that and brought Africa into the modern age. Yeah, that's his idea. But he says, but is the reception of education and industry and participation in capitalism, was it worth the cost? Was it worth the cost of the people? Was it worth the cost of the culture? Was it worth the cost of their democracy? I believe Du Bois would say absolutely and positively no. Being modernized, having modern education and modern industry was not worth the pain that that continent has and continues to deal with, and the destruction that has happened and continues to happen in that continent. That was not worth modernization. And so if we go on to page 47, he talks about the labor responses, right? And where it says laborers, Black laborers, he says laborers on page 47, but if you want to use your reading, he says laborers, Black laborers on the canal zone, right? Out of this chaos may be the great awakening of our race. There is cause for rejoicing if we fail to embrace this opportunity now. We fail to see how we will be ever able to solve the race question. It is for the British Negro, the French Negro, and the American Negro to rise to the occasion and start a national campaign jointly and collectively with this aim in view. So he's saying that there has to be a Pan-African response. There has to be a response where across the African diaspora, not just in the continent, but in the African Americans, the French Africans, the Brazilian Africans, the European Africans, Africans across the diaspora, across the world, have to come together and create a response to this issue. Pan-Africanism is part of the response. All of these African people, that's what Pan-Africanism is, the reuniting and the identity connection of all of these people under this Pan-African lens, that all of us are African, all of us are Pan-African, helping to bring about a solution to this issue of global capitalism and racialized labor exploitation. And so what I would like for you to do is I would like for you to read, and this is your solution activity, this is part of your online assignment. You are going to read pages 50 and 51. And again, if you're reading from the reading, it is the paragraphs. It may not be possible to build this state at once. You're going to read that all the way to, it's pretty long, it's about 2 or 3 pages. So all the way to where it says, does this sound like an impossible dream? Oh, no, it's not that long. It's about a page. Does this sound like an impossible dream? So you're going to read that. And then you're also going to read page 53, read the paragraph that says, secondly, this building of a new African state. So if you read those paragraphs, you'll get a good understanding of what Du Bois says the solution is. So you're going to read those paragraphs, and then you're going to explain in your own words and in detail, what is Du Bois' solution to global colonialism and capital exploitation based on those pages and paragraphs that you just read? What is his solution in your own words? How does Du Bois' solution compare to David Walker's appeal? Because there's some similarities there. So tell me that. And I want you to use quotes from both readings to explain. And if you notice, this is an online assignment, but this is how I want you to do your reflection papers. Your reflection papers are going to look kind of like this, where you're thinking through critically these readings, and then you're also going to make connections. So you'll see me do that often. You're going to make connections between this reading and previous readings. Okay. So again, I want you to critically think. I want you all to think deep. I don't want surface answers. That's what I'm looking forward to. Answer and address the above questions and statements. I want this to be a 2-page paper, double space, times the Roman 12 font, and the only information that should be at the top, same thing. Page, your name, the name of the class, and the title of the essay. It's optional. Make sure you submit this under online assignments. All right, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. You can email me, inbox me, or come into my office hours. And I would like to end this by reading the last paragraph of page 55. The hands which Ethiopia, the hands which Ethiopia, starts with that. The hands which Ethiopia shall soon stretch out unto God are not mere hands of helplessness and supplication, but rather are they the hands of pain and promise, hard-gnarled and muscled for the world's real work. They are hands of fellowship for the half-submerged masses of a distempered world. They are hands of helpfulness for an agonized God. And so I feel as though how Du Bois takes his understanding within the US context, applies it to this global understanding of race, capitalism, history, technology, globalism, colonialism, neocolonialism. And he puts it into a very succinct text, essays that help us as a discipline and help people at large to understand the levels of inequality that exist on the US and on the global scale, and provides us some solutions to these issues. So this is Du Bois. A lot of what we're going to read and deal with in the future comes out of Du Bois, which is why he is considered the father of sociology. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, inbox me, email me, come into my office hours. Look forward to reading your work. Look forward to reading the discussions. If you have any questions on anything, reach out to me, and look forward to interacting with you all in the future. Have a great day and Whenever you're watching this, have a great weekend.